Hi everyone, welcome to the Communication and Conflict YouTube channel, promoting mindful communication growth through conflict. So today's video might be the first of a few, given the depth of the topic concerned. I'm going to try to keep today's video to be in about 15 to 20 minutes, but honestly I think the topic itself I could talk about for probably 2 to 3 hours. Because of the strange suggestion that can be put out there sometimes that mediation should be something that is compulsory. And it kind of surprises me that the idea is still hanging around, because I think the points that can be made about mediation and why it's only effective because it's voluntary seem to have been made clear during the last 10, 20, 30, 40 years that mediation has been around. But still the idea persists, and I suppose in a sense I've tried to understand the reasons why that might be. They always seem to come from what seems to be, from my understanding, three different perspectives. The suggestions that mediation should be something that's made compulsory. So this is just my perspective on it. There may be other ways of kind of looking at it, but the kind of three different directions that I hear suggestions that mediation should be compulsory come from sometimes people who've kind of put mediation within a system, kind of at a particular place in a flow chart, and the expectation is that everybody or everything should go along the line of the flow chart. And so if you get people who don't want to participate in mediation, it kind of upsets the flow of the flow chart. There's entirely good reasons why it shouldn't be positioned as one step in a flow chart. It should always be available as a continuously available process in parallel to any other procedures that are in place. So you should always have mediation in parallel to a grievance procedure. It should always be in parallel to a complaints procedure, so that it can be used at any time during the life of the dispute that has gone through a grievance or complaints procedure or other adversarial process. But it should never be within the process. And so when people have put it within a process, or see it as being within just one available process rather than there being two operating in parallel, and they see that people aren't using it because it's voluntary, their answer is to say, oh well, let's make it compulsory, so then the flowchart works. So that's what I would call a system-led argument for making mediation compulsory. And of course what it doesn't do at all in any way, shape or form is take into consideration the needs and wishes of the people involved, nor of the content of the dispute, which might just in itself make it inappropriate for mediation. But it doesn't take that into account. It's what I would call a system-led argument for making mediation compulsory. The second reason would seem to be that, no, there's a risk I sound like I'm making generalizations here, and I don't want to. I want to acknowledge that what I'm about to say could sound I'm making a generalization about practitioners who have a legal background. I don't believe all lawyers are the same and they all think the same, but the predominant protagonists of the idea of mediation being compulsory seem to be people who are lawyers. So I guess this is just my perusal, my kind of hypothesis about it, that I guess because they're used to people in a sense being told what they've got to do within the legal system, because it's the law. If you've done something wrong, you have to go through the legal process. If people want to take action against someone in the legal process, they have to use the legal process. There are laws that define what people must and must not do. So it's all very directed, and it's all very much what I would call a kind of and necessarily so, a kind of a parent-child dynamic. There's a there's an overseeing authority that tells people what they can and cannot do, and there are practitioners within that context who also tell people what they can or cannot do, and obviously sometimes give options, but the point is those options are still informed by the overriding legal system and the laws that inform it. And so they're very used to telling people that they must or they must not do something. And so again, I suppose if they do then become mediators and they find that people aren't as cooperative in ways that suit their needs, i.e. that they've got to get an outcome, that they've got to close the case, they've got to get an agreement, they've got to get a contract signed, the ways in which they're normally measuring their performance, I suppose you could say, it's a bit of a kind of a shock to the system when people say, actually, no, I don't want to do this, I don't want to use this process. And because they're perhaps very used to the idea of simply going through a particular process and it starting at one end and ending at another, and it's all reasonably clearly defined how you go from one step to another, the idea that someone can choose at some stage not to have to go through that process because it's voluntary whether they are involved or not, I think it's kind of difficult for some of them to come to terms with. I mean, this, as I say, this is just my my kind of hypothesis about it, or this is just my kind of attempt to understand it, because it does seem to be predominantly people who've come from a legal background who argue for compulsory mediation. But again, that's what I would call a practitioner-led argument for making mediation compulsory. So we've got the system-led one, where the numbers aren't going as they should do, but that's more about the system not being designed properly. And we've got the practitioner-led argument for mediation being compulsory, because they're just not used to the idea that people really do have a choice about things and that they can make their own decisions. They have the capacity to make their own decisions about their difficult relationships with other people in whatever context it is, whether it's neighbour disputes, whether it's workplace disputes, whether it's complaints, and other things. So unless there is a legal aspect to it, in which case it wouldn't be mediation, it would be a legal process that's being used, then people have the right to choose. And it's not just about the right to choose, it's about the point being that it needs to be client-led. It needs to be decided by the clients if it's going to work. So that kind of contradicts with a practitioner-led process, and I think that seems to be why often there are arguments by practitioners, because they want people to kind of do what they're told to do, kind of thing. So as I say, I'm not saying all lawyers say that, but it does seem to be predominantly people from a legal background who take that kind of perspective on things. And then finally there seems to be, and in a way sometimes a lot of these kind of merge with each other, there are different kind of aspects of the arguments made that kind of cross over all three. So the third one is the moral argument. People should take part in mediation, and if they don't, they're bad people for not taking part in mediation. And the thing is, it's portrayed as if it's a kind of an objective view about people for not wanting to take part, but it's obviously just a subjective view. This person, so I'm the mediator, this person doesn't want to proceed with mediation, and that's because they're a bad person, because they're not being cooperative, because they're not doing the right thing, because they're not I don't know, they're not a good person, and because all good people should try mediation. And it's very judgmental, which immediately means, the mediator's not being impartial, so therefore they're undermining their own role by taking that kind of view. It's also very dismissive of the many reasons why people do not want to participate in mediation. So if I just give you one example, and I could give you many, but I won't bore you with them all. But if I give you one example, I used to be a director of a community mediation service in West London in the UK, and that dealt with neighbour disputes. And there was one case, as I say, countless I could give you, but just one case as an example. A neighbour wanted mediation. They were very willing to meet with the two mediators, because we used to have two mediators would work on cases, and so they were willing to meet with them separately first, and then the aim is that they may or may not choose to go to a joint meeting with their neighbour. And we contacted their neighbour to offer them an initial meeting just with them, and the neighbour turned it down. Didn't give a reason, just turned it down. So that happened reasonably frequently. I mean, in another video I'd probably explain the reasons why, if in many ways that wasn't too much of an issue, because there are things that we can do with individual neighbours anyway that help them to resolve their difficulty. But on this occasion, only one neighbour wanted to take part, the other one didn't want to, didn't give a reason. That was it. So we closed the case. Now, if you imagine that was compulsory, if there was compulsory mediation, that neighbour would have had to participate. So it wouldn't have been any taking no for an answer. They would have had to have met with our two mediators. They would have had to have a joint meeting. But fortunately, it's not compulsory mediation, nor I hope will it ever be. 6 months later, the neighbour who turned down mediation contacted us to say they would now be able to participate in mediation and would be willing to do so. And they said that the reason they didn't before was because their husband was dying from cancer and was in the latter stages of their life. And so the last thing they wanted to do was be involved in having mediation with their neighbours over some kind of dispute. Their focus was very much on their loved one, their husband who was dying, and all the different challenges that go with that. And anybody who's experienced that will know it's not a time you want to be dealing with outside stuff. You want to be just with your dying partner or husband. You imagine if they were compelled to participate in mediation in that situation. You imagine if they were compelled to give a reason why, if there was some kind of exemption possibility, that some people might say, oh, well, you could just have exemptions in that kind of situation. Well, even that's a thing they don't want to have to be dealing with. Imagine what that would be like to have them compelled to participate in mediation in that kind of situation, and how that kind of situation could generalize across all situations where it's suggested that mediation is compulsory. So in a workplace dispute as well, someone might have good reason for not participating in the mediation process. It might be a reason they don't want to share with anybody. It might be a reason that is just they just don't want to, and if they did, therefore, if they were compelled to, they just wouldn't be able or willing or inclined to try to cooperate with the process anyway, so it would be a waste of everybody's time. But still, there are these kind of arguments to suggest that mediation should be made compulsory. It just doesn't fit with what mediation's about. And what it does is it treats everybody as if they're all the same, which is why, as I say, it's kind of a, if it's coming from a system-led or a practitioner-led angle, it's understandable, because you don't have to really take into consideration anything about the people involved. They're just kind of like widgets that are being pushed through a system for the benefit of the system creator or the practitioner. And there are arguments that are put forward that say, oh, well, mediation is successful in, I don't know, 70%, 80% of cases, whatever, which are all questionable statistics. And I'm not saying mediation isn't effective, but how it's measured is so widely varied in terms of what success means. But again, in a lot of those situations, the success is measured by the numbers that go through the system rather than whether it genuinely leads to an effective outcome. The numbers are measured by a practitioner who says, look, I got an agreement, as if they got an agreement. Obviously the participants create the agreement, but it's about kind of bigging up the practitioner that they want it to be that way, because they're getting outcomes which don't necessarily work for the participants, but they work for what the practitioner needs to get down. So there's this big focus on getting a written agreement, as if that's always going to be the answer to people's difficulties. But if the practitioner is very forceful in their approach, and they're much more able to be forceful if the process is compulsory, it gives the participants very little choice. And so it's not client-led, it's practitioner-led. And they come out at the end and say, look, there's an agreement. It's all very good for the practitioner. No use whatsoever for the participants, but that doesn't matter because the numbers look good. And these are features of many of the points that are raised as reasons why mediation should be made compulsory, because they say it's 70% successful, so therefore, if you triple the numbers that are having it by making it compulsory, then it's 70% of that tripled number, whatever it is. But that's a delusion, because the whole point of mediation being effective is because it's voluntary in the first place. So by making people go through the process, it doesn't mean to say they're all going to be 70%. There's not going to be the same 70% effectiveness. And by effectiveness, I mean what works beyond the mediation, not some kind of symbol of success that can be very easily created in the meeting that doesn't actually represent anything of any use to anyone beyond the meeting. The only kind of example that I would give to compare it with is the situation of divorce mediation in the UK, and I think it's true in the US as well, where people are compelled to have what's called a MIAM, a mediation initial assessment meeting. The idea behind that was to explain to people what mediation is, so that then they all understand it, and then they all, like to have it and go forward. What's not recognised is that because it's compelled from the start, people get a sense that they're compelled to go through the whole thing, and it also manifests sometimes in the mediator's behaviour themselves, that they think that they're compelled to have the MIAM, so therefore they take an approach which is more compelling in the mediation itself. So it's kind of treating the people who are divorcing more like they're almost being told what they've got to create as an outcome. Now, the reason I say that's an example of where it's not effective is you might look at the numbers and say there's an improvement, although I think it's still thought that the numbers are too low, even though it's meant to be compulsory. But what isn't looked at is the fact that most of these kind of outcomes that happen through mediation in that context keep coming back to court afterwards anyway, because they don't work for the people involved. They weren't created by the people involved. They were in many situations almost kind of imposed on people, even though mediation is meant to be a client-led process. And there'll be a lot of divorce mediators out there very unhappy that I've said that. But all I can go by is my own experience, that without comparison, divorce mediation is the most complained about form of mediation that I've ever come across. Without comparison, it is the one that people are most upset by. And why would you be upset by mediation? It's the only area of mediation where I've ever heard of mediators being abused and threatened. I've never come across that in any other context. What can you do as a mediator that would mean you get abused or threatened? It's a voluntary process. You're not pushing people into anything. You're giving them a free choice. If they don't want it, you're not staying at the door, putting your foot in the door, trying to keep yourself there. You accept that they don't want it, and you leave. You're not trying to push people into coming to particular decisions. You help them in making their own decisions. I can't imagine what it is about the experience of divorce mediation that means that mediators are being abused or even threatened in some situations, other than the fact that it carries an essence of compulsion within it. I mean, I've been working in mediation 25 years. I've never had participants threaten me or abuse me, because I'm never trying to push them into anything. I'm providing a client-led choice about what it is that they wish to do. And if what they wish to do is not to have mediation, I'm not going to try to force them. So that's just the first aspect of what I want to say about compulsory mediation, and why I think it's a surprise to me that the suggestion is still out there. And I've tried to kind of understand the reasons why people are still pushing it. And it might sound like some of my suggested reasoning sounds a bit cynical, but I think I am a bit cynical. I genuinely don't think the reasons behind wanting to make it compulsory are in the interests of the people involved. I think they're for others' interests and not the interests of the parties involved. And I've yet to hear a persuasive argument to say that that's not the case, because the focus in all of them is always on something secondary to the participants. Indeed, the participants rarely get mentioned, other than perhaps to have that kind of moral judgment of them for not wanting to participate, because it seems to be inconvenient for the mediator when they don't. So let me have your thoughts on that. If you have ideas about compulsory mediation, whether you agree with it or disagree with it, please put them in the comments section below. As I say, I could easily probably do 2 or 3 more, because there are so many reasons why compulsory mediation is, for me, it's a self-contradiction. It can't work effectively if it's made compulsory. But I'm just kind of surprised that there's still arguments out there that try to suggest it should be. But anyway, as I say, please put your comments in the section below. Agreements, disagreements, questions. If you do, in many ways it will give me other things that I can kind of respond to in the future ones as to why I think, again, it just doesn't work for it to be compulsory. If you like the video, please press the like button. If you think other people might be interested in hearing it or watching it, because I'm also doing this as a podcast, please share it with those people as well. And let me know what you think, and please subscribe to the channel as well if you think you'd like to see more videos on this kind of topic. Thanks very much for watching. Bye bye.